Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Fascist? Today we're going to be taking a look at ANTIFA, or ironically enough, anti-fascism. Now, a number of people asked me to do this one, and I thought it was an interesting idea because this is something you particularly hear a lot from libertarians or more libertarian minded conservatives, that the left is fascist, that Antifa is fascist, the Democratic Party's fascist. And I kind of wanted to take a deeper look without really a bias one way or another and just see, does it meet the definition that I've come up with for things that are important for something to actually be part of a fascist movement? I also think it's fair because I did the opposition to Antifa, specifically MAGA. And for the first couple of episodes, I kind of want to get a bit of a mixture, so a couple things that are debatable, something that's fairly clear. I have one coming up that got 12 out of 12 on the scale, and I'm sure people can guess which one that is when it comes out. But let's take a look at Antifa. Are the Democrats the real racists? Let's find out. So, Antifa is a bit difficult to kind of categorize compared to some other things. I don't think there's really a central ideologue from it. It, in my opinion, bears the most resemblance to critical theory, particularly more kind of anarchist conceptions of it. I don't really see much in the way of Vanguardism that you had in traditional communism. It reminds me a lot more of Maoism, particularly the Cultural Revolution, where it's very much like an uncontrolled, decentralized mob. There may be like leadership in terms of major influencers or major publications or stuff like that, but I think a lot of it is actually fairly grassroots, or at least fairly kind of done at a local level. Granted, I think the biggest argument you could argue, and this is always kind of when we get into liberal versus conservative politics, is the left in general has a much larger professional activist class. So I'd imagine a lot of people who are Antifa and kind of get into that mindset will start to get their living expenses paid for by George Soros or the media or other rich people. But I'm not really convinced that it's an entirely a top down thing rather than kind of the result of decades of left wing academia and developments out of like Gramsci and Maoism and just other aspects of critical theory. So that being said, let's take a look at this. The first category, or the first criteria we're going to look at is an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary slash conservative and revolutionary slash progressive ideas. Now, I see a lot of conservatives will say, yes, this applies because they play identity politics. They talk about race, they talk about gender, they talk about religion and culture and all these kind of things. And that this is something that we've moved past. This is something that only existed in the Enlightenment. Now, that is most definitely not the case. Race, gender, all that stuff has been a key part of politics for all of human history and will continue to be part of politics for all the remainder of human history. So I don't think really bringing up those issues is that relevant. The idea is more is the spin they put on them like that. Do they endorse traditional masculinity? Do they endorse ethnic nationalism? Do they endorse religious orthodoxy? The answer, of course, to this is an overwhelming no. I guess you could argue there is a certain veneer that they will put on it, where they'll talk about preserving traditional Amerindian culture, or they'll talk about black culture, or they'll talk about all this stuff that apparently happened before colonialism destroyed it. But if you look at it, it suspiciously enough seems that all civilizations before contact with the West resembles 21st century critical race theory or 21st century Antifa ideology. It's interesting that the like Sioux and the Lakota and all these people had the exact same political ideology as 21st century college grads with dyed hair. I mean, it's kind of a coincidence. But no, it's very, very superficial. Any aspects that they take, they put they use it as a veneer to try to add some sort of legitimacy to their nonsense, and then apply that. Even the definition, because they use indigenous a lot. Indigenous, I mean, obviously they aren't going to say that Europeans are indigenous to Europe, but they will also exclude like the Han Chinese or the Yamato people in Japan or the Indo-Aryans in India or any number of other indigenous peoples. They will make set sort of appeals to ethnic nationalism or self-determination at some times. But once again, if anything is at all ideologically opposed to their central agenda, that is immediately jettisoned, and so they get 0 points for this category. Number 2, identitarianism with a clearly defined in-group and out-group, cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. I mean, this one is very straightforward, and they're going to get a point for this. The inside... So a lot of people will say the left, particularly kind of the more far left, is incoherent because it's a mixture of like radical Muslims, you'll have economic socialists, you'll have anarcho-communists, you'll have all these different people, you'll have feminists, but also trans advocates, and they'll be like, well, these groups are ideologically inconsistent. The reality is they're bound together by who they hate, and that is specifically white people, and more specifically white males, and more specifically than that, white Christian heterosexual males. And if you look at it and how they respond, their level of hostility to people is based on how many of these criteria they meet. If someone is a heterosexual white Christian male, they are like the bottom of the pile. Then if they're a white male, they're like next. And it's even gone to the point where if you're a Christian male, which is what happened with Kanye, then you're going to be thrown under the bus. As well, I know this is a lot of basic talking points, but you don't see Antifa, at least I haven't seen them, aggressively campaigning for Israel, or maybe they do for Israel, for Japan or Turkey or India or China to accept mass immigration from the third world. You don't see them saying the Chinese people have to be exterminated culturally and ethnically. It's just, it's extremely obvious that even if the in-group is sometimes a bit vague, it's an identity that's built primarily around who they hate and who they want to destroy. A revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historic foe. This one is kind of tricky, but I think for the sake of argument, for the reasons we discussed previously, there is, even if it's very superficial, an appeal to romantic nationalism, to kind of noble savage narratives, to stuff like that, to the general idea that before Europeans destroyed everything, all these places were in Eden, we was Kangs, and as soon as we destroy the West, we destroy white civilization, things are going to go back to this previous state. So I would say it is fueled by a deep resentment. It's a little incoherent, though, because of the fact that it is a multi-ethnic, multicultural coalition, many of whom are mutually exclusive in terms of their belief systems. But I would say this definitely applies. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. People might disagree with me with this. I think Antifa is more of an anarchist movement that's more based on mob justice and mob rule, and is very decentralized. If you look at it, there's often not really a rhyme or reason for who they go after. It's whoever kind of catches their eye, they wind up destroying. I don't think it's as organized as people say it is. I think there are opinion leaders, there are people who know how to direct the mob. But I think as a general rule that the followers and adherents are just conditioned and they will just automatically go after what's ever in front of them. With regards to state power, well, they will use the state. I don't see them as being statist in kind of the traditional way that communists were either early on. Aside from that, they generally speaking will adhere to some sort of neoliberal internationalist economics that almost kind of really resembles the classist Marxist idea of the state withering away once utopia has been achieved. Number 5, a conception of an idealized new man. I mean, do we even need to go into this? The new man, you always get the coomer, the soy boy. What is the whole everybody is trans, everyone is non binary, everyone is gender fluid is not a conception of a new man or a new it. I think the ideal society to a lot of these people is a society where every single person is trans or every single person is a hermaphrodite. I think there is a deep, the ultimate kind of agenda is that no one is born the correct gender. Once they can do transracialism, I'm sure that's the next thing. I'm sure that if they can figure a way to create human animal hybrids, that's also on agenda. The current conception is not only do we need a new man, we need a new man every other week, and we have to keep upping the ante, and we have to keep getting more and more radical with our definition of it. Next on the list, a nationalist foreign policy combined with an amoral, zero-sum, or realist conception of international affairs. This one is difficult because one of the reasons why this question is in here, as with some of the others, was to try to differentiate fascism from communism. Because a lot of communist or neoconservative foreign policy is very ideologically driven, where the interests of the specific state or country or some sort of grander plan are very much secondary to spreading things. Now, in this case, they will. It's kind of a two-sided thing, wherein they will view whatever regime impacts Christians or white people or whatever, or the West, even if it's something that's anathema to them, like ISIS or China or other people who would probably kill them if they got a chance to, they will support that out of a sense of they are kind of on their side, so they're able to assist with it. So I'm going to give this a half because it's not fully pragmatic, but it definitely has a very strong ideological impact on it. Or you know what? I'm actually going to give this a full point because they have started to go after Saudi Arabia and some of the more hardcore Muslim countries and tried to pressure them to change. Or actually, no, sorry. I mean, I'll give this 0 because this does not apply. An indifference to or marginalization of economics, I think that's 100% the case. This is a debate you very often will see. I mean, this was the whole kind of impetus of the whole dead dog Democrat thing, where it's like the blue dogs, or as I call them, the dead dogs, were social conservative Democrats who voted Democrat because they were working class, they were blue collar, they were union members, they relied on things like Medicare and Social Security, so they tended to vote Democrat even if they were conservative on issues like abortion, American identity, and immigration, and things like that. And you don't see that anymore. I see largely an indifference to things like unionization, worker rights, a general sort of redistribution of wealth. I can't recall the last time one of them really talked about class warfare. It's completely gone away in favor of the conception of things being based on race or gender or things like that. It is very much an identitarian movement in that regard. A masculine approach to problem solving focusing on decisive action. This is a tricky one because the whole thing is very much against conceptions of masculinity, but in a lot of ways it's a lot more masculine how they deal with problems than conservatives do. I mean, if you go to like the Black Lives Matter branch, they just burned down cities and they got what they wanted from doing that. Antifa will just go up and destroy statues and smash things and basically just bully the state into doing whatever it is they want them to do. So, despite the whole soy boy meme, despite the Coomer meme, despite all the trans stuff, I would argue they actually are substantially more masculine and decisive in the way that they deal with things. They're certainly more willing to use violence than conservatives are. I mean, like, they succeeded with the Chaz. Remember Ruby Ridge? Remember the Broof Dravidians? Yeah, we're gonna give them a 1 for that. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. I mean, it is, in my view, kind of a form of anarchism, wherein it's about the mob, it's about people taking individual initiative, people searching out people, looking into their personal lives, finding enemies of the movement, and then systematically destroying their reputations, their ability to feed themselves, and in a general terms, their lives. It is very much not a vanguardist organization, at least in my opinion. And I would definitely say that, yes, this applies as well. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite inner group to safeguard the new order slash revolution. I really don't think this is a case. I think one of kind of the interesting aspects about 1984 is, even though it's vanguardist, the inner party lives in constant terror as well. The outer party is probably the worst off members of it, but it's so paranoid. Everyone's so willing to just rat on each other and snake on each other and stab everybody each other in the back, that it doesn't matter if someone's the leader. You will get this all the time, wherein someone who appears to be a leader will say something slightly unpolitically correct, or they'll say something politically correct, but it was politically correct like a week ago, and now everything's different. Now it's year zero. Now it's the current year, and they throw that person to the wolves. So I really don't think it's vanguardist. You have people like George Soros who fund a lot of it. You have a lot of elites who support it, at least tactily. I don't think it is a centralized operation, though. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. I'm going to say no once again. You could argue maybe during the Obama era, but I feel like in 2012, or when the Great Awakening happened, and especially after Trump won in 2016, is when things really got turned up to 11, when you really started to have mass political violence become a regular part of American politics. I don't think there's really a clear leader to any sort of to Antifa. You'll have people that some of them will hold up, like the Bernie Bros or Justin Trudeau or something, but none of them have a particularly dominant or powerful position within the movement. So I'm going to say no, because once again, I think it's a form of anarchism. Sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. I would agree with this. And I would agree with this because you have things like history doesn't matter. I think the entire conception of your truth, or someone's truth as opposed to the truth, more or less puts them in this category, because it relies on the conception that objective reality doesn't exist. Individuals' guilt or innocence is solely based on what the politics of the time dictate. So if someone accuses a man of rape, even if there's no evidence and it's not the case, then it's her truth, and that trumps the other person, or the conception of blacks as a group trumps the conception of someone, a white person, to have private property rights or the security of their person. Also, if you look at it, whenever somebody breaks ranks, like you get a black conservative or something like that, they are immediately destroyed. They are declared non-persons, and they are basically blown away, is what I tend to find. So I would say this definitely applies. It is very much a collectivist movement, albeit kind of an anarchist one. And that brings us to our tally, to our total, which is interestingly 8 points, which is the lower end of para-fascist, but it is outside of, I guess, what you could consider normal within a liberal democracy, or within kind of a normal, even left-wing movement. It scored somewhat similar to MAGA, but it actually scored a bit higher. And I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this, because a lot of people say, well, it's Antifa, so how can it be similar to fascism? Well, fascism is like a totalitarian right-wing ideology So a totalitarian left-wing ideology is going to have a lot of overlap. This is kind of where we get into the whole conception of horseshoe theory. So some of the things that kind of explain horseshoe theory is, number one, if both groups, both the extreme right and extreme left, hate 90% of society, the vast majority of people they hate are going to be people the other side hates as well. They might be with the 10% might be in the 90%, but there's still like a 70% overlap, if you kind of get what I'm saying. Also, the more extreme you get politically, the more willing you are to use violence or extra legal methods of dealing with things. And that necessarily will add a certain degree of similarity into it. Another thing, particularly, I think, what if I was to do communism with this, for instance, like let's just go back because people always call Antifa communist. You would have stuff like this would probably not be the case. Revanchist or romantic nationalism. This would be the case. This would be the case. This would, okay, I said that one wasn't. Economics would matter a lot more to an actual communist government. This might not matter. It depends on the form of communism we're looking at. This really depends. I feel like the Soviet Union after the Stalinist era, if anything, kind of wanted to be a more technocratic state and discouraged mass political participation. I feel like to a certain extent, China post-Mao was also kind of like this. Traditional communism is vanguardist, whereas Antifa is not. You will often have a charismatic leader in most communist societies. Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Stalin, you could say Gorbachev, Mao, obviously, Deng Xiaoping. Most of them will have a cult of personality over a leader. You'll have this too, but it'll be state-focused instead of necessarily group-focused. And so communism would probably be in the parafascist category as well. And that's kind of by design. Like I said, if the two things are 60% similar, then they should be 60% similar on this list. Granted, the particular set of values also matters. And this is, when I'm doing this, I'm not grading whether or not I agree with something. Like, obviously, if this was a Christian group, I would agree with it more. And I'd say it was their views were good as opposed to bad. But I'm just looking as if they're identitarian or not is it a type of identitarianism that I personally agree with. So hopefully that makes sense. So Antifa is going to go into the parafascist category. I think it's more a form of anarchism, but it's kind of strange in that it's anarchism that's extremely identity politics focused. And I guess you'll have aspects of that, like with the Zapatistas, but it's not localist, which is also kind of weird because a lot of forms of anarchism, like the Zapatistas, are we just want our area to be left alone. We want to live our traditional lifestyle. We don't want the central government to really bother us. And you just don't really see that with Antifa. You see it as them wanting a totalitarian society, but not necessarily one where the state is the main form of enforcement. They will use the state, but they're just as willing to use corporations or groups or have a plurality of different accesses of power within society in order to carry out their will. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. I do try to be objective with these, at least as much as you can be. God bless everyone. More exciting content to come. Just a side note, a lot of people suggest things like the Helghast Empire. I can't do a video on something I'm not familiar with. So if I haven't played the game or read the book or seen the movie or whatever, I'm not going to do a video on it because I just don't think it's fair. If I happen to do one of those at a later date, maybe. But if I turn something down, it's not necessarily because I think it's a bad idea or it wouldn't fit. I just don't want to include something that isn't relevant to me personally. Anyways, guys, more exciting content to come.